and just direct you to the chat where the tech support number and instructions for closed captioning have been posted. And in the interest of time, we should probably go ahead and get started. And folks are still, I think, trickling in, but I imagine that folks will get here as they're able. So welcome everyone to day 2 of Cultural Proficiency, Building a Kingdom Mindset. We'll start with a quick review of some of the things we talked about yesterday, and then we will jump into some new concepts and then give some time for y'all to practice using those new concepts and applying it to some specific situations within your places where you're actually thinking about this work. Again, just as a reminder, my name is Jihan Oh. I'm serving as the Director of Mid-Council Ministries in the Office of the General Assembly. And Molly, you want to do a quick introduction of yourself again?
I am Molly Castile, and I am the Manager for Equity and Representation in the Office of the General Assembly.
And so to start off with, yesterday we talked about intercultural competence. We didn't really do a slide at that point to actually highlight the definition for intercultural competence or cultural proficiency, but the IDI definition is the one that we are using. And intercultural competence is defined as the ability to shift perspective and adapt behavior to cultural difference and commonality, and I think in appropriate and authentic ways. And so the pieces here that I think are really important is that it's not enough just to be able to shift framework and understand where people are coming from. It's the ability to adapt behavior in a way that is appropriate and authentic both to the culture that we're engaging and to ourselves and the culture that we bring. But it's actually those both and for that. It's also the both and of difference and commonality, that we're not just adjusting to differences, but actually holding commonality and difference in tension and in balance and being able to adjust in that way. And so that's the definition that we're working under. We also talked about yesterday the implicit bias, and we talked about the implicit bias being the subconscious, unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that actually do affect how we understand others, our actions, our decisions, but that it's really underneath the surface. And so those are the pieces that are running in the background. We went over very quickly that there are 11 million bits of information per second that our brains are processing, and only 45 bits of those are conscious per second. And the 11 million bits, not all of them are about these implicit biases. Some of those 11 million bits are really things that our brain is doing in order to keep us alive, like how to breathe and how we keep upright and walk and those sorts of things. But there are also these other implicit associations that are underneath the surface that are actually relating to how we actually relate to others and how we're making decisions and things like that. And so again, it's automatic. It doesn't necessarily align with our beliefs as we state them out loud explicitly. And it can actually then predict behavior by reinforcing in-group identity. There is this concept of priming that we'll talk about in a little bit, where our brains are then primed in order to perpetuate. These implicit biases are perpetuated and transmitted through mass media, through stories that we tell, through family conversations, through all of those pieces. And this is how implicit bias then continues to be perpetuated. So some examples of institutional implicit bias from Race Forward. Doctors are less likely to prescribe life-saving care to Black people and people of color. We've heard some of those reports, even during COVID, about a medical doctor, Black woman, who actually was told that she was blowing her symptoms out of proportion, and they tried to send her home, and she's a doctor who was saying that she was feeling really sick. Managers are less likely to call back or hire applicants whose names they perceive to belong to people of color or to groups that are not their in-groups. And so they've done research switching people's names and sending the exact same resume, and the call rates were higher. Dark-skinned children get punished more severely, or actually their attention, teachers' attentions are given to them much more to look out for troublemaking behavior than lighter-skinned or children of color or white children. And there's all sorts of other ways in which language and how language gets used that actually goes towards stereotyping as well. And so I'll hand it over to Molly to talk a little bit about priming and how that actually works. That's part of our newer content building upon what we talked about yesterday.
Thank you. So so we've kind of talked about that 11 million bits and all the things that it's processing. The primes, the stories, and the stereotyping that we are encouraged to participate in. We are absorbing constantly, and we are absorbing them regardless of whether we agree with them, right? And so the preponderance, there are whole economies based on the effectiveness of our brains to be prompted to pre-attend to some content more than others. And so, as we kind of think about our brains, I also want us to think about kind of our bodies as a whole. Our bodies can hold knowledge and tell us what we know more effectively than cognition sometimes. So that tickle in your throat, or the way in which you feel the hair on the back of your neck or your arms, or that kind of spidey sense is sometimes how someone will say, or they suddenly need to move, or their shoulders are rising, their tongue is suddenly at the top of their mouth, they're breathing more shallowly, etc. All of these are ways that our body is giving us indicators of emotional and social cues that we are not necessarily consciously absorbing, right? And so priming is one of those tricks of the mind body, the kind of animal nature of us, that taps in to that knowledge and manipulates it, right? So our attention is culturally trained to notice some things and make meaning of those over others. Whole industries exist to influence our behavior and attitudes. We just survived a major political campaign, and priming is central to the ways in which messaging, both the images, the sounds, all of those kinds of things are intended to provoke deep feelings of in-group or out-group, of threat or comfort, etc. Right? So there's cues in the environment all around us, coming from all sorts of sensory input. A lovely example of priming, and an easy example, is that I don't know a realtor who doesn't understand that baking a pan of cookies in the new house in the hour before an open house increases the positive regard for that home in the people who come and visit it. Sometimes they offer those cookies, right? Other times they're relying on the sense of that particular smell, and they're picking the cookie based on the kind of preferred customer, right? So sometimes it's, in certain neighborhoods, it might be chocolate chip cookies. In other neighborhoods, it might be ginger snaps, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of understanding how people work and using it to provide a more positive environment for the sales pitch is a common tool in realtors kind of ideas. Just because priming is literally the mechanisms of how we navigate between cognition and emotion and what we know. One can interrupt. These biases are tapped into. They're installed and tapped into by these kinds of narratives and conditioning, but they can also be interrupted. And so part of the process to interrupt priming for break or for separation or for negative hierarchy or judgment of another is to stop and think. Literally, this image doesn't make sense, right? Sorry, we're open. What? That's contrary, right? So sorry, we're closed makes sense, or we're open makes sense. Sorry, we're open makes me pause. Humor, there's lots of ways we kind of tap into this disruption of an expectation in order to create attention. But as you are attempting to interrupt biases, stopping and getting people to stop and think is important. You can reprime. You can purposely set into your experiences. You can counter program the biases that you're responding to. You can change the channel to a different set of primes and messages. You can choose a number of those kinds of things, and you can remove the opportunity. You can remove it altogether. All of that is to kind of get us into this framing of what separates us is this impulse to describe it as there's me and there's them. And creating thems, we can create thems in a variety of ways. They do not have to be very different from us to be described as other. The wonderful people at UC Berkeley, there's an institute called Othering and Belonging Institute. John A. Powell is one of the kind of central thinkers. He has amazing books, Racing to Justice. Anyway, look him up. He's got many good things. But he has reframed their work into this othering and belonging framework, because the separation impulse that creates all of the inequities is this move. So how can they bring the attention to those moments where we're behaving into and creating deeper separations? So the othering kind of concept, the ideas, the behaviors, the attitudes in there are on the screen, right? The us versus thems, ideas, polarization. If it's focused on outgroup, it's they're not us. It's us and not us. And it's driven by comparison and competition. The self is seen as the system. So I am the perfect exemplar of my group. And if you are like me, you are in my group. And if you are not like me, you are not in my group. When we talked about the intercultural development kind of continuum, the mindsets of denial and polarization live in this permanently othering space, right? It's just me, not me. So there's hierarchy. There's power is wielded inequitably. There's high individualism and many breaking behaviors. So these are behaviors that create separation and distance. Belonging, on the other hand, is intending to build a bigger we, which means that it is attempting to expand the in-group. You can see how when we layer the kind of concept of kingdom mindset, that the images from the Bible stories that we lifted up and many others is about expanding the we. So belonging is vigilant for connection and empathy. It is a self, but it is self in a system. So I am one of many in my community, and not all the people in my community are identical to me. It's a behavior, attitude, and orientation that helps create solidarity, the larger self in context, and not being alone. Bridging behaviors in large connections and understanding. Now, obviously, those automatic primes, it's much easier. We are frequently primed to spend most of our time in othering, competition, capitalism, power over, winning and losing. Those are all othering kind of frames. And so it takes work to get into the belonging mindset. Othering behaviors obviously there's ways in which the automatic behaviors can be heightened. So there's less intention often in the othering piece. It tends to be more of that automatic. You can predict behavior. It reinforces the in-group identity. It's perpetuated everywhere. We're told who we are often. In belonging, it's deep interrelationship. It recognizes and accommodates difference. Humans are more than, who they, anyway, they're not isolated. So the Martin Luther King's beloved community is kind of an image. It's a narrative of belonging. Belonging can impact health, performance, life expectancy, mental and emotional well-being. It's communicated through structures, culture, and personal interaction. So if those are kind of the mindset, these big kind of concepts, these, orientations to the world, othering, am I going to other folks, or am I going to attempt to build belonging? Then there's behaviors. And those behaviors in the othering and belonging kind of framework are breaking, bridging, and bonding. There are places for breaking, bridging, and bonding in all healthy systems. There are times when someone is so harmful that breaking for a time is a useful thing. But frequently, breaking behaviors are really their habits, their ways that continue the isolation, that heighten the, I would say from a kingdom mindset, it is a lie that we can be all that God wants us to be on our own, right? So we talk about John Calvin, we admire John Calvin's theology, and John Calvin, one of the first sentences in the Institute says that, I know God, and to know myself, I know God, and to know God, I know myself, right? I'm paraphrasing poorly, but this idea of the connection is critical. So you can see here how we relate matters, their automatic behaviors. Part of interrupting biases is becoming more intentional in our behaviors. Thinking through when you're feeling othered, what is the behavior? What am I reacting? What am I responding to? Why do I know I'm being othered? You frequently have behaviors that are breaking, where someone is name calling, where someone is making a distinction between you and whomever is the group. There's isolating, there's, kind of, you're being labeled, you're not being allowed to participate in a conversation, you might be silenced or sidelined. All of those kinds of behaviors are breaking. Other sides of that, right? In bridging behaviors, you reject a them altogether. So you make every effort to not objectify any person or group, and you attempt to listen empathetically, my brain, that word. So deep listening, you're recognizing suffering, you're seeking connection, and you're intentionally rejecting the invitation to be othered. So we have expectations of folks, and so it's harder if we are really isolated. It's harder for us to even see bridging behavior as bridging behavior when it's happening, because it's so atypical. Narratives, stories that we tell, the media that we consume, the ways in which we encourage us to lean into belonging matter. And those can be primes for where our attention, where we want to be, who we want to be. So if we have primes and we've got othering and belonging as these frames, and we have this goal of wanting to build a kingdom mindset, and we understand a developmental framework that intercultural capacity is kind of a moving, you know, a multi-directional moving force, and folks can find themselves in experiences, in encounters where they feel out of ill-equipped, and they start behaving more in their primed or implicit bias space. It helps, right? That stop and think was the first step in interrupting bias. And so we're going to ask you to kind of think of that as a choice point, right? So a place where you have some influence, you have some capacity, you can exert some autonomy. If you allow for your habits to just take over, you're making the same choices, doing the same thing, and having the same outcomes, right? For good or for ill. The habit, the easy road of a habit is predictable. A choice point then says, I'm going to orient myself toward a more open, whatever my goal is. I want to have a more belonging. I want to bridge with persons who I am taught to think of as other. I want to build a bigger we. I want to follow Christ's example in this particular aspect. So how may I choose a more equitable action or option? And then obviously, if you choose to act differently when you come to that place where you have stopped and thought and you've noticed, you are not going to get the same old outcome that you got before, because you've made a different choice in that particular moment. So the hope for is that choice points, choosing more equitable options, then gets you equity, inclusion, and more solidarity. You're building toward the we. Here are some simple examples of choice points, because you have there are opportunities for you to make intentional choices about what you notice, how you respond, and what meaning you make of that, and and influencing the persons around you all the time. And those choice points that come to you are offered daily, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, and annually. And there are ways that you can change your practices in all of those things that will influence your organization, your community, your family, and frankly, even your own perspective on your own kind of life. So here are some examples. In a consumer decision, a personal decision, where to shop, what to buy, if you participate in a boycott, in an institutional budgeting setting, what are you prioritizing? What are you adding and cutting? When your budgets are declining, what is cut? What is peripheral and what is central? Who to hire? In socializing, who do you spend time with? Does that happen automatically because of just where you are, or do you make a particular effort to shift who you socialize with? Voting. So you see many examples from race forward. We are about to go, is this the place where, yeah, this is where we're going to pause. And Jihan, do you have the handout? We're gonna give you a little worksheet, and we're gonna go to breakouts to have a conversation around choice points, and ask you to think about perhaps even the situations you talked in your small groups yesterday about, identifying kind of places where you were seeing the developmental mindsets kind of at play, and places where you want to focus on in your particular context. Now ask if that works, go back to that same situation, and you've got a worksheet in conversation or individually and then in conversation, try to identify some choice points for each of those categories around opportunities to make shifts.
So before we head into small groups, we're going to ask you for about a minute just to do a quick brainstorming. So whether you want to use the situation or the scenario that you used yesterday in sharing in your breakout rooms, or whether there are other scenarios that you can think of, whether that's where you're responsible for leading some planning, or whether that's actually a personal life scenario, to come up with some examples of the things that you'll do. We'll give you a minute to do so, and then pick one scenario that you do want to work with in that breakout room. So we'll give you about a minute to do that before we send you into breakout rooms. And you'll notice that I did drop in the choice points handout worksheet in the chat. And so go ahead and open that up to use during your breakouts. And I will open the breakout rooms now.
There's a question in chat about kind of confusion around the scenario. The scenario is your own choice. So just identify a place where your mind has wandered to as we've presented some of this content. There's probably situations, persons, moments. Just think about picking one of those. It's up to you. $5 minutes, right? Setting the timer.
Yeah, it was. Hello, Dania and Cheryl. Good to see you all. We're just coming back from breakout rooms in about a minute.
Okay, good. Trying to keep up with different time zones and conflicting.
Oh, yeah, it's a challenge. And not all the times, I think, were the same for the workshops. It shifts a little bit each day. So,
well, yeah, and the column talkbacks, but the reflections for the sermon was really good today.
Awesome.
And I think they took us right up until the time you started.
Okay. That's what it was. We were like, there must be something else that's actually keeping folks, because usually folks are showing up a couple of minutes beforehand.
Was it Aisha preaching today?
No. Paul Roberts.
Paul Roberts, excellent.
Yes. Now, the good thing about this is that apparently all the worship services were recorded and they'll be available afterwards. So,
oh, nice.
There was someone asking me, is there a way we can come and online and see just the worship services? Like, no, you need to register.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Just a quick time for us to actually lift up any insights that you had from your breakout rooms. There are folks who would like to share an insight that you had from the breakout rooms.
Gosh, we didn't get enough time. It was a different person. So by the time we introduced ourselves.
Um,
We were done.
right. Right. Thank you. We'll take that into account.
Yeah, same for us. We got started on one on Becky's situation, and then we saw the warning that we were gonna return in a minute. So
Jihan and Molly and others, I think Daryl and I were together, and an observation is we start where we are where we are. And we are, we may have different levels of experience and or application, but in our dyad, we each indicated something that we were attempting to bridge and adapt to consistently. And that for me illustrates one of the points that maybe Molly made yesterday as part of being educators reading the room, that there are people in the room who are in the whole continuum, and having even that awareness and being able to affirm wherever somebody is as okay is helpful. So that's my takeaway for now.
Thanks, Sarah. My internet is acting up, so that's why I am off the screen for the moment. Any other insights?
One thing that occurs to me after visiting with Erin both yesterday and today is that sometime we realize there's a choice point after a particular decision has already been made. And so we kind of talked about, we didn't really, as we say, we were, like Debbie said, we ran out of time, but that was kind of an interesting insight for me. So thanks, Erin.
That kind of hindsight / regret of missing a choice point, or
And so then how do we perhaps do some compensating or some bridging, I guess might be a different, the word to use in this context.
A repair.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, or realizing that there is a choice point, and we may have thought we anticipated some, scenarios, but it may present then another series of choice points that we could.
That is exactly it, right? The choice points are almost legion, and sometimes this kind of perspective on just the humanness of everything will help. So the language and lingo will help us say, this is what happened, this is what we did, this is what we want. How do we, often even just stating that harm has been made is a huge move toward acknowledging the full humanity of everyone involved. That kind of, being able, Greg likes his 5 R's. Greg Bentley, as co-moderator of the current assembly, is, he has 5 R's, and recognition is one of them. It's powerful to name what just happened or what is happening, and stating and claiming publicly an intention to do and be different. Right? The next choice point may be repair, but it's a choice point.
Yes.
And to that end too, that there's a way in which we can then also take those opportunities afterwards, I think, to review and then set in place processes that would help us to identify those choice points earlier, or to prime ourselves to actually act differently. And so the next piece that we want to talk a little bit about then is the idea of equity primes. If our brains can be primed for implicit biases and associations, then we can also do the intentional work of priming our brains in order to actually work towards equity. And so there are a couple of some examples that we want to highlight. One is the example of a New Jersey court system where they were noticing that there was this prison to that they were judges were overwhelmingly using only 1 or 2 options for sentencing and continuing to contribute to the school to prison pipeline. And so they gathered a large group of folks who were involved in that process. So not just the judges, but the social workers and other folks who were actually in that school to engaging with those youth who were actually in that pipeline to talk together about what it was that they could be doing to shift that dynamic. And what they came up with was a really simple solution. So you don't need high tech to actually do this work or anything elaborate. They came up with a little card that each of the judges sat with as they were thinking about sentencing to remind them of the fullness of the options that they had, that they did not have just those limited choices. And so that desire to disrupt that inequitable system, that inequitable process meant that they identified where the choice point was, and that was around sentencing for the judges. They identified a way to prime their brains differently so that they knew that they had other choices, and then instituted that. And what I like about that example is really that it was a collaborative group for the design. It wasn't just the judges sitting around and saying, well, what could we do? It was judges, it was social workers, it was teachers, it was a bunch of folks who who were all interested in disrupting that process, who got together and actually had that conversation. Another example that we want to highlight is Molly and I did a training for a Synod PJC, and they sat together and identified places where they were making choices that affected accessibility for folks who are participating in the PJC process for that synod. And one of the things that they realized that was a choice point for the synod was where to hold the meetings when we were not doing it online. And they identified that for the longest time, there was an assumption that the synod would meet at a particular city, a particular location, and the PJC recognized that that was actually a choice point, and they could make different decisions around accessibility so that folks could actually come and be present for that process and participate in a different way. That was just one of the many pieces that they identified as choice points and how they would actually prime themselves for equity. But that was a clear example. So Molly, anything that you would like to add about the equity primes before we go to the questions?
Hopefully the text on the screen kind of gives, it is part of my accessibility, my reminder is that, text is not accessible to all. And so the challenge of having a text heavy piece is that only those who can read quickly on screens in this kind of setting can kind of access that. So I would highlight that an equity prime is a reminder that evokes consideration and consciousness for whatever the impacts across identity might be during an important kind of choice point, a place of influence. And it interrupts or counteracts unconscious bias. So it's engaging the priming for automatic habits that exclude. And it's a beginning. So if short term is an equity prime, medium term might be an equity protocol where an organization or a group of people decide on a set of practices that they're going to take as a group. And then culture shift being one of the goals, going from othering to belonging. So you see it in kind of the wider frame.
Thanks. So we want to try to do a little bit of a case study here in the group. And let's just go with option one for right now. So there's a congregation holding an online event, as is many of our realities right now, for the community to talk about mission and justice. And the surrounding community has changed over time and is demographically really different from the church membership who shows up to church to participate on a regular basis. And so you are members of a planning team for the event. So everything from communication to invitation of speakers to online meeting format, all the pieces that actually go into this online meeting planning. And so just sort of given that scenario, I know that that's a really broad brushstroke, but what might be some choice points that you might identify in this work? I'm I guess making an assumption that most folks have been involved in something like this, and so can sort of fill out the the blanks about the scenario to think about some choice points there.
Well, so I would think of the age of the surrounding community. If it's an older group of people, the way you're going to try to communicate with them, and some may require training in how to use the online method that you're choosing. If it's a younger community, how you invite them to participate might be different. So that would be a choice point, age.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. And so you're making choices around how to communicate, what other things need to be added in order to prepare people to participate, all around the age of, around the question of age and what folks might be able to do. Thanks. Other folks, other choice points that emerge for you as you're looking at the scenario?
Well, I would wonder if the planning team was not already representative of the community around me. I would say we can't go any farther until we get representatives from the community that is around us.
Yeah, that's a great choice point to identify. Who's on the committee, right? Who's helping plan this thing, right? Yeah, thanks. Others?
Well, I think too, thinking about the community, the why behind having this, like what is your purpose of having this?
Yeah,
I think that's a good.
Big.
Yeah, thanks, John. So identifying goals, right? Yes, Daryl, sorry, go ahead.
You may also consider people that would normally not come to your church-wise, and they're seeing you online physically. So how can you keep and retain them and get them to come in and participate as well? Because I know we're addressing that, or trying to address that, with people that have never set foot in our doors, but yet viewing us religiously every week.
Yeah, so asking questions about who's missing, or who's coming new into the communion and these relationships that haven't before. Yeah.
And I would also wonder, what is the community's access to reliable internet and devices to access the content? And do we need to do something about that as part of making this accessible to a broad number of people?
Yeah. So format, right? And the decisions we make around formats and multiple formats and those sorts of things can be a choice point that goes towards equity as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Connected to the why question, is the purpose an assumed purpose on the congregation's part, or is it a real need within the community? And how do we discover that real need? Because sometimes we're primed to make assumptions on different groups and different demographics, and that's not always what's in the trenches. So where is that why coming from?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so not just motivation, but really, how do we even assess need for such an event, right? That's a huge question and can be a choice point about what sort of event that actually might be around these topics. And Denise, the other piece that sort of occurs to me really that so when we talked about the intercultural development continuum yesterday, that part of some of the minimization mindset that might be present is that we actually quite often assume that people are like us, or that we can make really broad brushstroke generalizations about what people need or want or are thinking about or care about. And so checking those assumptions out and making sure that those spaces are always negotiated and not just assumed can be an important choice point as well.
I was thinking the thing that came to mind was the book Toxic Charity, and it goes along with that, those assumptions that we know what the community needs, and so maybe who we have as our speakers are people who are actually helping us to discover what the community needs as we approach the topics of mission and justice.
Thanks.
Talking about age, I work with children, so I kind of go the other way. And I think I usually ask, what age audience would this be appropriate for? Could we invite middle schoolers and high schoolers? And then you can reach out to the local schools to tell them that there's this event happening, because sometimes they need extra credit hours or to put forth hours for community public events. So so going the other way.
Yeah, thanks. So how do you engage partners already in the community? And how do you actually then also make age appropriate decisions if you want to reach not just one age group, but multiple age groups, so that this is sort of an intergenerational piece? Danita, you have your hand up. Yes.
Every community has gatekeepers. And it's and it's something that tends to get overlooked because we don't always know who they are. But it's really important, especially in the planning stages, to include those kind of folks so that we definitely have, for lack of a better way of describing it, our finger on the pulse of what the community needs are, felt and real, and whether we're even responding and communicating in a way that people can receive and respond to. And Neighborhood Church, somebody mentioned that book in the chat, has some really good suggestions and direction for how to accomplish that.
You're also raising the issue of the language that we use, that it can actually be culturally grounded words that don't communicate across the sort of in group that we're thinking out of, right? And Julio, did you have something as well?
Yeah, that just adding to what Nita said and also adding to what you just said, the language, like in my community, I have Polish, Spanish, and English. So I have three that I have to be concerned about in my community to do this.
Wow.
There is a follow-up afterwards. Who didn't show up? Why didn't they show up? And then follow about why they didn't show up. And just to look into all that. It's not just the pre-planning and the event itself afterwards, if you want to reach the whole community or as much as you can.
Yeah, thank you. Becky.
Yes, I worked for a church plant. And the church plant really started off as a outreach to homeless and, people in an area of the city that were primarily in their 20s and 30s, college students, a lot of transient community. And I was hired to do children's ministry, of which there really weren't that many children. And yet there were a lot of people there that wanted to do a lot of social justice things. They really were into, Black Lives Matter and all of that kind of stuff. But the majority of the congregation was like 98% white. And it was very difficult, you know, there were some real drivers on the whole Black Lives Matter thing. They wanted to do book studies, and they wanted to have committees to talk about it, but they did a whole lot of talking and not much action. And yet how is a congregation like that supposed to actually, get busy working in that community when they're not, and the community around them was not diverse. And the neighborhood was not diverse, and yet they expected, and they only had like maybe 4 or 5 people of African Americans that were a part of that congregation. It was very difficult to try to figure out what I don't know where I'm going with it, but
well, and Vicky, it almost feels like it's a perfect setup actually as we transition out of today's session and we actually preview a little bit of tomorrow. That really, as folks have said, it's when we sort of look at these scenarios, when we sort of imagine something, it's easy. Sometimes, those sort of choice points emerge. But when you're sort of looking at your own situation, perhaps it's not quite as easy to identify those choice points, especially if you're leading a group of people. It's not just you making those choices, but it's more about a group or an institution actually moving forward together. And so tomorrow, what we hope we'll be able to do as we continue to work on applications of these things is what are the scenarios that you want to actually work with? What are some strategies? What are some ways to think about choice points and equity primes in order to make some change or to actually do some thinking around programming or whatever that piece actually may be that you want to deal with. And so what we are going to ask you to do, there's some pieces for reflection that's Molly has put on the screen for you. But what we're going to ask you to do is to give some thought over, until before tomorrow about the scenario that you really feel like you want to sort of wrestle with tomorrow, and what choice points and also equity primes might be emerging as you continue to give thought to that. And we will tomorrow then really work towards talking more about that and actually doing some action planning and sharing ideas for that. Molly, any additional announcements that you have as we wrap up our time and make way for the next workshop to happen?
No, I would just take a screenshot of this screen. There are many wonderful things here, and they are just here for if you would like to kind of explore some more. But I would highlight that the implicit bias module series on Curran Institute is an online educational series, really 4 parts, go detailed into implicit bias, and could be a wonderful tool for all of your contexts.
Thank you all for your engagement today with the topic and with one another and with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow then. Take good care.
Thanks.
Bye.